I was in Nepal recently as part of a learning visit under the Climate Change Local Adaptation Pathways project. While visiting the village of Kagbeni in Mustang, we had the opportunity to meet with Professor Neil Adger from the University of Exeter. Neil is a human geographer and a leading voice in the field of climate adaptation, migration, and social resilience. For over 2 decades, his work has explored how communities respond to environmental change with a strong focus on justice, well-being, and the institutions that support or constrain adaptation. His research brings in not just science and policy, but also empathy, culture, and the human experience. In this conversation, I spoke to him about mobility as adaptation, the role of institutions, and what it really means to build resilience in a changing world. Neil, how did you first become interested in the relationship between climate change, migration, and adaptation?
I first worked on adaptation to climate change in lots of different places. And in particular in Vietnam, we noticed that one of the big issues coming through was the vulnerability of coastal areas to mangrove loss. And we realized that it was remittance income that was being used to invest in these rather unsustainable practices. And so I became intrigued by this idea that migration could add to adaptive capacity, or it could actually detract from adaptive capacity. So from those first empirical steps, I then worked with demographers, worked with teams going forward, and we've investigated this relationship, complex relationship, I have to say, between adaptation, migration, and adaptive capacity over the last years.
There's a growing recognition that migration is not just a crisis response, but also a strategy for adaptation. What does a shift mean for how we understand resilience?
Migration is absolutely a key variable, a key element, a key effective strategy for adaptation to climate change. It is, at its simplest, spreading risk. It's spreading risk across space in the same way as we invest to spread risk across time. It would be inconceivable if people didn't migrate, didn't move, didn't share their assets, and didn't interact between places they've moved from and places they moved to adapt to climate change, as they have adapted to every other risk and economic policies and the rest of it. So, it is central, I think, mobility being central to adaptation to climate change is a different way to look at it than simply saying, are the risks of climate change going to make people move in a one-off situation? I think our research has tried to bring understandings from migration studies, from demography, from economics, and from political science through to looking at this nexus between these. I think that does feed through to ideas of climate resilience. So what does a climate resilient society look like? We can't see that just as a sedentary place, a place that is threatened, a place that is static, and a place that will be habitable or uninhabitable. Rather, what we need to do is to see that climate resilience involves all sorts of strategy, and mobility being absolutely one of them.
People in South Asia are experiencing both slow and sudden climate events. What are your thoughts about how they are making decisions about staying or moving?
This region is so diverse. We're here in Mustang in Nepal, at the upper reaches of some of these catchments where flood risk is a huge issue, where changing snowfall patterns, where glacial retreat is changing the nature of water resources. And people are moving here, or that climate change is amplifying some of the underlying social trends that are going on and therefore contributing to some of the social dynamics here. And that ranges right down to the deltas where the sediment from up here in Nepal arrives, where that sediment flow is changing the nature of char islands, is changing the nature of the coast. So there's such a diversity of livelihoods, of ways of life, of farming systems, of cities. And to try to get a handle on that, I think success and CLAPS, they're such an interdisciplinary team, and across all those different geographies is really, really important to get insights into this. But there are universal issues that we are picking up. We know that climate change can increase the precarity of livelihoods. That seems to be a key universal factor. What constitutes adaptive capacity for these different contexts, for different populations, for different cultures, is of course much more nuanced and less universal, and therefore solutions need to be much more targeted or thought about in a much more spatially constrained context.
You have written about justice and equity in climate adaptation. What does climate justice look like when we talk about mobility?
At the heart of it, adaptation to climate change involves a major injustice. No one wanted to have the harm of climate change imposed on them. No one voted for that. So there is this climate injustice at the heart of adaptation to climate change. But in saying that, we need to move towards sustainable worlds. We need to move to sustainable and dignified futures for places and for populations. And therefore, the principles of justice are absolutely core. The principles of climate justice are core to that thought, to that concept, and to the practice in these sorts of areas. And that involves including everyone who's affected, processes and procedures and recognition of everyone who's affected and bringing their voices to it, no matter who they are, because everyone has a stake in the future. And also a fair allocation of resources towards adaptation to activities that are sustainable and that they themselves will lead to a more equitable society, a more equitable agricultural economy, a more equitable access to resources going forward.
Climate research is often associated with hard science and policy modeling, yet your work brings culture and empathy into it. Why do you think these human elements are so crucial?
The role of culture, the role of social norms, however you want to portray it, it's about people and how people adapt to risk in their lives, how people make decisions about themselves, about their health, about the health of their family around them. And therefore, we cannot understand adaptation to climate change without understanding cultural context. But we do need to be rigorous about this to provide evidence that speaks to policy and speaks to the public discourse on these things in terms that people understand. So we need to understand what people value, the things that people value in their lives. And of course, half of social science is about what people value. And so I think there are insights from economics, from anthropology, from human geography, and many other disciplines that speak about this. And I think a lot of this, the most integrative concept in this is the idea of place and how we deal with our lives, with the places around us. And that place is not just the physical place, the economy around us, but also our relations with others around us. And I think those ideas of place and culture and identity have to be put central to how we do adaptation to climate change. Otherwise, it's not going to be effective.
Neil, you have also emphasized the role of social resilience in climate adaptation. How do you see institutions evolving, or are they failing to support it?
The institutions of government are absolutely key to adaptation to climate change. If you want to put it in theoretical terms, many aspects of adaptation to climate change are public goods. Information about future climate risks needs to be put in the public domain. Everyone needs to understand that. But we need centralized science to provide that public good. So, governance, collective action, both spontaneous collective action. Here in Mustang, we've been looking at women's groups and their role in evolving role of women's groups whenever there is out male migration, through to the formal resource allocations by governments, through to adaptation funds at the UNFCCC level. All of these need to be aware of the ideas of mobility, how people are coping, what their adaptive capacity looks like in a modern world that is actually much more mobile.
Adaptation is often local, but its drivers are global. How should policy then navigate the tension?
Local agency is absolutely key to getting adaptation right in places. People make decisions, all politics is local. Decisions are made about the places where people live. But the world is globalized, and that gives a resilience to systems through the flow of remittances, but it creates challenges for the evolution of society in these places. So agency, allowing that or recognizing that multi-local, that linkages that people have, not just with the immediate place they are, but with everywhere else, is key to making effective decisions.
What do you think are the urgent actions or shifts that we need to support climate-affected migrants?
The most urgent policy actions to support climate actions in the context of climate change in South Asia, as we're now witnessing it, is really one major priority is infrastructure. The public space, the roads, just the flood risk, these are how climate change is really being experienced, the lived experience of climate change, as we've seen right across our study areas across 4 countries here in South Asia. So one thing that local agency is limited in is the allocation of resources, and therefore those resources towards building adaptive capacity, some of it through infrastructure and some of it through localized learning and agency and decision making about future livelihoods. The government sector, the private sector, entrepreneurs, local councils, women's groups, everyone is acting together to look towards the future. Here in Mustang, the evolution of this apple crop has only been really in the last 20 years, and it shows that these climate niches are changing, but people are ready, willing, and if they have the infrastructure and if they have the backing, there are many ways that we can adapt to climate change.
What would you say to young researchers and local leaders grappling with climate risks in their own communities?
My advice to young researchers coming into this field is to embrace interdisciplinarity. That always sounds very generic, but I think we need a generation of researchers that understands the rigor that we can bring to understanding how social processes work. This is not just something that we feel or something that we can put into a black box, but to look at the social determinants of how things happen. Who moves, who stays, what are the implications for the shape of a population, the aging of population, all these different dynamics that are going on. We need rigor and we need policymakers as well as scientists to understand that social dynamic as well as the ecological dynamic and even the climate risks in this area. So please take up your pens, take up your reading, work with each other and work towards this interdisciplinary understanding, because we won't solve the climate crisis and we certainly won't have effective adaptation unless we do so.
After all these years in the field, what gives you hope?
This work gets me up in the morning every day, but we are living in challenging times. And I think the price of progress in these challenging times is eternal vigilance. I think we need to work both as scientists and as citizens and in our political spheres to ensure that these messages about climate change, about the precarity of populations caused by this and the climate injustice around these whole issues is brought to the wider world. I think as storytellers, as scientists, as citizens, we need to engage with this and have empathy with the people who are actually feeling these consequences and having it affect their everyday lives, as we've seen right across South Asia. But I am hopeful and optimistic about this, because when we see community action, when we see learning about this and the depth of understanding, then resilience is absolutely ensured. But that doesn't let us off the hook in terms of decarbonising the economy, avoiding the worst impacts of climate change, because the current impacts are already with us, already being seen and already causing injustice.
From global responsibility to the quiet power of empathy, Professor Neil Adger reminds us that climate adaptation is never just technical. It is personal, political, and deeply human. His work pushes us to think beyond infrastructure and policy and instead consider the relationships, values, and decisions that shape how people live through change. As the climate crisis deepens, voices like his continue to guide how we respond with nuance, justice, and care.